In 249 BC, off the coast of Sicily, a Roman consul named Publius Claudius Pulcher stood on the deck of his warship and called for the sacred chickens. This was standard procedure before any major military operation in the Roman Republic. Priests known as Polari traveled with the fleet, tending to cages of chickens that the Romans believed could channel the will of the gods. The ritual was simple. You opened the cage, scattered grain on the deck, and watched. If the chickens came out and ate eagerly, scratching around the way happy chickens do, the gods approved. If the chickens refused to eat, the gods were warning you to stand down. On that morning, the chickens refused to eat. Pulcher, furious that a bunch of birds were about to derail his surprise attack on the Carthaginian fleet, reportedly grabbed the cages and hurled the sacred chickens into the Mediterranean Sea. "If they will not eat," he said, "let them drink." Within hours, Pulcher lost nearly his entire fleet. However, the strangest part of this story is not the defeat itself. It is the fact that for most of human history, the chicken was not a meal. It was an oracle. How does a bird go from deciding the fate of empires to living 47 days inside a warehouse before it is slaughtered and shrink-wrapped at a grocery store? That story starts about 3,500 years ago in the forests and rice paddies of what is now Thailand, Myanmar, and southern China. A small, colorful, easily startled bird called the red junglefowl lived in the thick undergrowth of tropical forests across Southeast Asia. 5 different varieties of this pheasant inhabited a broad arc stretching from the jungles of Indonesia to the Himalayan foothills of Pakistan. These birds were shy. They spent most of their time on the forest floor, scratching through leaf litter for seeds and insects, and they could fly just well enough to roost in trees at night and avoid predators. The males had brilliant red and gold plumage with dark green tail feathers, and they crowed at dawn. The females were smaller and duller, built for camouflage. They looked almost nothing like a modern chicken, and unlike most domesticated animals whose wild ancestors went extinct long ago, the red junglefowl is still alive today. Researchers can literally walk into the forests of Thailand or Vietnam and observe the original version of the bird we reshaped into a global commodity. For most of their existence, humans and junglefowl had no real relationship. Scientists debated for over 2 centuries about where and when domestication actually happened. Charles Darwin argued it happened in India. Archaeologists claimed it happened 9,000 years ago in northern China. Others pointed to Pakistan around 2000 BC. The dates and locations kept shifting, and nobody could quite pin it down. But around 1500 BC, something changed in Southeast Asia that finally gave us our answer. Farmers began planting dry rice, a variety grown on upland soil soaked by seasonal rains rather than in flooded paddies. And those open fields full of scattered grain became irresistible to the junglefowl living at the forest edge. The birds started venturing out of the trees to feed on rice and millet, and over time they became comfortable around people. That comfort, slowly building over generations, is what started the domestication process. It was not a deliberate capture, it was a slow mutual arrangement. The birds got easy food and the humans got a useful animal hanging around the village. A team of researchers published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2022 that pinpointed this connection between rice farming and chicken domestication. The earliest confirmed chicken remains come from a site called Ban Non Wat in central Thailand, a dry rice farming community that dates to between 1650 BC and 1250 BC. The researchers concluded that cereal cultivation acted as a catalyst, drawing junglefowl down from the trees and closer to human settlements. Additional genetic evidence suggests that domestication likely happened independently across multiple regions in Southeast Asia, not in a single location. There was probably some crossbreeding with the gray junglefowl along the way, which added further genetic diversity. But the core ancestor, the bird that gave rise to every chicken on Earth today, was the red junglefowl of the Southeast Asian forest. Those early domesticated chickens were not kept for food, not for eggs, and not for meat. The evidence suggests that humans first valued chickens for cockfighting, for religious ceremonies, and for their crowing, which helped mark the hours of the day. The chicken's journey into human civilization began not as a protein source, but as something closer to a spiritual companion. And across the ancient world, this spiritual role was not a minor footnote. It was the whole story. In Zoroastrianism, One of the oldest religions still practiced today, the rooster held sacred status. Zoroastrian texts describe the rooster as a creature that fought against darkness and evil with its morning crow. The bird's call at dawn was not just an alarm clock, it was an act of divine combat, summoning the faithful to prayer and driving away demons that thrived in the darkness before sunrise. Persian religious writings portrayed the rooster as a direct agent of righteous action, and this reverence ran deep enough that the Greeks eventually called the chicken the Persian bird because of how central it was to Zoroastrian worship. The Kayanian period of Persian legend, stretching roughly from 2000 BC to 700 BC, is filled with sacred references to the rooster as a divine messenger. This was a bird that mattered to entire civilizations. In ancient Babylon, the rooster was considered the bird form of the true shepherd of Anu, a divine figure. And the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Phoenicians all worshipped a deity named Nergal, whose name literally translated to fighting cock. This was a bird that sat at the intersection of religion, warfare, and daily life across the ancient Near East. And as the chicken spread along trade routes from Persia into the wider Mediterranean world, it carried that sacred reputation with it. When chickens reached Greece around the 5th century BC, likely through Persian trade contacts, they arrived not as livestock, but as fighters. The Greeks held annual cockfighting festivals that carried real religious significance. Roosters were held up as models of bravery and valor, and young warriors were expected to watch cockfights and learn from the bird's refusal to back down. The sport was violent, but in the Greek world, it was also sacred. Terracotta figurines from the 2nd and 1st centuries BC show children watching cockfights, and the imagery appears across Greek art and pottery. Cockfighting may actually be the oldest continuous sport in human history, and its origins are inseparable from religious ritual. The birds were not entertainment, they were the embodiment of martial virtue. And then there was Rome. The Romans took the spiritual connection with chickens further than anyone. They kept sacred flocks tended by specialized priests, the Polari, and consulted these birds before every major decision. This practice was called taking the auspices, and it applied to military campaigns, political appointments, construction projects, and even legislative assemblies. The chickens were not pets. They were instruments of divine communication. The way a bird ate, how eagerly it scratched the ground, and whether grain fell from its beak as it fed all carried meaning. A chicken that ate well signaled divine approval. A chicken that refused to eat was a warning from the gods themselves. This was not some fringe superstition practiced by a handful of mystics. This was official state religion. Roman generals, consuls, and senators all operated within this system, and the consequences of ignoring it were taken seriously. Which brings us back to Publius Claudius Pulcher and his disastrous decision on the coast of Sicily in 249 BC. Pulcher was a consul of the Roman Republic during the First Punic War against Carthage. He wanted to launch a surprise naval attack, but the sacred chickens refused to eat. Rather than cancel the operation, Pulcher threw the birds overboard and attacked anyway. The Battle of Drepana was a catastrophe. The Carthaginian fleet destroyed most of Pulcher's ships, and the losses were staggering. When Pulcher returned to Rome, he was put on trial. But the charges were not about military incompetence. He was prosecuted for impiety, for defying the will of the gods by disrespecting the sacred chickens. The Roman state took the offense against the birds more seriously than the loss of a fleet. That is how much the chicken mattered in the ancient world. When chickens spread westward from Asia into Europe, they traveled along maritime trade routes used by Greek, Etruscan, and Phoenician merchants. These traders carried chickens across the Mediterranean, not as cargo for dinner tables, but as exotic, culturally significant animals. The birds were rare, they were unusual, and they were treated with reverence. The research team from Oxford School of Archaeology confirmed that this westward spread began around 1500 BC and moved first across mainland Asia, then into the Mediterranean world along established maritime corridors. During the Iron Age in Europe, chickens were not regarded as food at all. Archaeological evidence from this period tells a remarkable story. Researchers found that many of the earliest chicken remains in Europe were unbutchered. The birds had not been eaten. They had been buried, and not just buried randomly. Chickens were frequently found buried alongside humans in what appear to be intentional ritual burials. Male were buried with roosters, females were buried with hens. The chickens were companions in death, placed with the same care as personal belongings and symbolic objects. These were not scraps thrown in a trash pile. These were deliberate, respectful burials of animals that clearly held deep meaning for the people who kept them. Early Christianity absorbed some of this symbolism. The rooster became associated with spiritual struggle and resurrection. Chicken motifs appear on early Christian artifacts, and the tradition of placing a rooster figure on top of church steeples traces back to this long history of the bird as a spiritual sentinel, the creature that announces the dawn and calls the faithful to attention. It took several centuries after chickens arrived in Europe before people began eating them with any regularity. The transition from sacred animal to food source was gradual, messy, and regional. And even when Europeans did start eating chicken, the bird remained a relative luxury for a long time. Through the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, chickens were backyard animals. Nearly every rural household kept a small flock, a rooster and a handful of hens scratching around the yard. The hens laid eggs, the roosters crowed at dawn, and occasionally a bird would end up in a pot for a special meal. Chicken was not everyday food, it was Sunday dinner, if that. A whole roasted chicken on the table meant something. King Henry IV of France reportedly declared that he wanted every peasant in his kingdom to be able to afford a chicken in the pot on Sundays. The fact that this was considered an ambitious goal tells you how far from ordinary the bird still was. For centuries, this arrangement barely changed. Chickens were small, they grew slowly, and they converted feed into meat inefficiently. Raising them for meat specifically was not worth the effort when beef, pork, and lamb were more practical. In the early 1920s, a typical meat chicken took about 16 weeks to reach a market weight of just 2.5 pounds, eating roughly 12 pounds of feed in the process. The economics were terrible. Chicken meat was actually more expensive per pound than beef. The chickens people ate were almost always old-laying hens that had stopped producing eggs or spare roosters. Dedicated meat production barely existed. Then came the 1940s and everything changed. The Great Depression had made animal feed cheaper than ever, which opened the door for farmers on the eastern seaboard in states like Delaware, Maryland, Georgia, and Arkansas to experiment with raising chickens specifically for meat. These early operations were small and scattered, but they proved the concept. Meanwhile, World War II created massive demand for protein to feed troops overseas. The government encouraged citizens to grow victory gardens and raise chickens in their backyards. Flock sizes grew, and the infrastructure for poultry production started taking shape. The real turning point was a contest. The fact that a single breeding competition could reshape the biology of a species and launch a global industry still sounds like something out of a science fiction novel, but it happened. In 1945, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, better known as A&P, was the largest grocery retailer in the United States. At its peak, it was the biggest retailer of any kind in the country. The company had recently been convicted of criminal restraint of trade by the Justice Department, and it needed to repair its public image. So A&P partnered with the United States Department of Agriculture to sponsor something unprecedented, a nationwide competition to breed a better chicken. They called it the Chicken of Tomorrow. The goal was specific and ambitious. They wanted breeders to develop a chicken that grew bigger, grew faster, put on weight in the right places, especially the breast and thighs, and converted feed into meat as efficiently as possible. They wanted a bird with plumper drumsticks, more white meat, and a better appearance after processing. They wanted a chicken that could make poultry competitive with beef and pork as a staple protein, not a luxury or an afterthought. The contest began with state-level competitions in 1946 across 44 states, moved to regional judging in 1947, and culminated in a national final held at the University of Delaware Agricultural Experiment Station in 1948. The scale of the effort was staggering. 55 national organizers, including scientists and bureaucrats from government agencies and land-grant colleges, coordinated the competition. Hundreds of volunteers participated. Each of the 40 finalists shipped 720 eggs to a central hatching facility where the chicks were hatched anonymously, raised under identical controlled conditions, and fed a standard diet for 12 weeks. Their weight, health, and appearance were monitored constantly. At the end of the trial, the survivors were slaughtered and judged on the quality and quantity of their edible meat. On June 24, 1948, the results were announced on a stage decorated with boxes of chicken carcasses from each contestant's batch and frozen cross-sections of the top-scoring birds. They even held a parade through Georgetown, Delaware, with floats depicting the phases of the poultry industry and a smiling festival broiler queen riding on top of a car. The winner was Charles Vantris from California, who had crossed a New Hampshire hen with a California strain of Cornish to produce a red-feathered hybrid with outstanding breast conformation and rapid growth. The Vantris chickens demonstrated exceptional growth at just 6 weeks with a mortality rate under 7%, remarkably resilient for the time. The runner-up was Henry Saglio, the teenage son of Italian immigrant farmers in Glastonbury, Connecticut, who had bred his family's pure line of white Plymouth Rocks into a muscular, compact bird. His father, Frank Saglio, was an immigrant from Italy who grew fruits and vegetables on a small family farm. It was Henry's birds, raised by a teenager on a Connecticut homestead, that would change the genetics of chickens worldwide. Both of these bloodlines went on to reshape the entire poultry industry. Saglio's family built their winning birds into a company called Arbor Acres, which supplied parent stock to every major broiler company in America. The family also helped found the National Chicken Council, the industry's main lobbying organization. By 1964, Arbor Acres was producing chickens cheaper and faster than anyone in the world, and Nelson Rockefeller bought the company and took it global through his International Basic Economy Corporation. As of 2013, over half the chickens raised in China traced their genetics back to Arbor Acres stock. A teenager's birds from a small Connecticut farm now ran through the bloodlines of billions of chickens on the other side of the world. The Chicken of Tomorrow contest did not just produce winning birds, it produced a new industry. And the thousands of farmers who lost that contest, most of their farms are gone along with their ancestral chicken breeds. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the broiler business went through a rapid transformation that reshaped American agriculture. Entrepreneurs began combining and coordinating different stages of production under single companies. The hatchery, the feed mill, the growing operation, the slaughterhouse, and the distribution network all merged under one roof. This model was called vertical integration. By the mid-1960s, 90% of all broilers in the United States came from integrated operations. In 1942, an Illinois processing plant became the first facility to perform government-approved assembly line evisceration and packing of whole chickens in ice-filled wooden crates. The slaughterhouse had become a factory floor. The contract grower system emerged alongside this consolidation. Individual farmers signed contracts with large companies to raise birds in company-owned facilities using company-supplied feed and company-bred chicks. The farmer provided the labor and the land. The company controlled everything else. This arrangement shifted the financial risk away from the corporations and onto the farmers, many of whom had previously lost their farms trying to independently finance chicken feed purchases. A handful of companies, names like Tyson, Purdue, and Pilgrim's Pride, came to dominate the entire chain from egg to supermarket shelf. The small family poultry operation, the kind that had entered the Chicken of Tomorrow contest with homegrown heritage breeds, was being swallowed whole. At the same time, the discovery that antibiotics like tetracycline could promote growth in animals added another accelerant. Birds grew faster on antibiotics, and the cost of production dropped even further. Penicillin and bacitracin joined the mix shortly after. These were not used to treat sick animals. They were fed to healthy birds as growth promoters, a routine practice that would later raise serious concerns about antibiotic resistance in humans. But in the 1950s, that was not on anyone's radar. The focus was on speed and scale. Chicken meat, which had been more expensive per kilogram than veal in the late 1940s, began to fall in price. By the 1960s, chicken was becoming the affordable everyday protein it remains today. The bird that kings once promised their peasants could have on Sundays was now cheaper than the bread you ate it with. But what happened to the chicken itself during these decades is where the story gets truly strange. In 1957, researchers at the University of Alberta in Canada preserved a strain of commercial meat chicken as an unselected control line, meaning they kept breeding the birds without selecting for any particular trait. The flock was frozen in time, genetically speaking. They did the same thing with a 1978 strain. Then in 2005, they ran an experiment. They raised birds from all three eras, the 1957 strain, the 1978 strain, and a modern 2005 commercial broiler, side by side under identical conditions with the same feed. After 56 days, they weighed them. The 1957 bird weighed 905 grams. The 1978 bird came in at 1,808 grams, roughly double. The 2005 broiler weighed 4,202 grams. That is more than 4 times the weight of the 1957 bird raised under the exact same conditions, fed the exact same food. The difference was entirely genetic. Decades of selective breeding had produced a bird that grows at a rate its ancestors could not have survived, and nearly 90% of that increase came from genetic selection alone, not from changes in feed or housing. The researchers confirmed that the rate of increase in body weight from 1957 to 2005 was 3.3% per year compounded over 48 years. The amount of feed required to produce a kilogram of chicken meat was cut in half over that same period. The modern broiler chicken reaches market weight in about 47 days. Some operations push that even faster to as little as 35 days. In 1925, it took 112 days to get a chicken to 2.5 pounds. Today, a bird reaches over 6.5 pounds in less than half that time. The breast meat yield has increased by 80%. Feed conversion, the ratio of food consumed to meat produced, has tripled in efficiency. But that speed comes with a cost the bird pays every single day of its short life. Because the skeleton and organs of a modern broiler cannot keep pace with the rate at which its muscles grow, these birds face severe physical problems that would have been unimaginable in their wild ancestors. Studies estimate that up to 30% of commercial broilers suffer from leg lameness, meaning they cannot walk properly because their legs simply cannot support the weight of their own bodies. The rapid growth of breast muscle shifts the bird's center of gravity forward, putting abnormal stress on joints and bones that were never designed for this kind of load. Healthy broilers spend about 76% of their time sitting or lying down. Lame birds spend even more, up to 86% of the day, because standing and walking cause pain. At harvest weight, healthy birds spend only about 3% of their day walking. Lame birds manage less than 2%. Heart failure is another consequence. The cardiovascular system of a bird, bred to grow this fast, often cannot keep up with the demands of supplying blood and oxygen to all that rapidly developing tissue. Sudden death syndrome, where an apparently healthy bird simply drops dead from cardiac arrest, is a recognized problem across the industry. The immune system also appears to be compromised. Research has found that the intense selection for growth came at the expense of immune function, leaving modern broilers more susceptible to disease than older breeds raised under the same conditions, and the genetic diversity of chickens worldwide has narrowed dramatically. A study from Purdue University published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that 50% or more of ancestral chicken breeds have been lost, and the steepest decline happened in the 1950s, right when industrial production took hold. The thousands of farmers who entered the Chicken of Tomorrow contest with their own unique heritage breeds disappeared almost as quickly as the breeds themselves. Today, there are somewhere around 26 billion chickens alive on Earth at any given time, depending on which estimate you use. The Food and Agriculture Organization has put the number even higher in some reports, above 33 billion. Either way, the domestic chicken is the most numerous bird on the planet by a massive margin, outnumbering all other bird species by an order of magnitude. Roughly 74 billion chickens are slaughtered worldwide every year. In the United States alone, that figure is over 9 billion. To put that in perspective, that is more than one chicken killed per person on Earth every single year. The chicken is the single largest source of animal protein consumed by humans, and its population has nearly doubled since the year 2000. In 2000, there were about 14 billion chickens. In 2 decades, the industry nearly doubled that number to keep pace with demand. Over 46% of the global flock lives in Asia, where the whole story began thousands of years ago in the rice fields of Southeast Asia. China alone keeps more than 5 billion chickens. Indonesia has another 3.5 billion. Brazil and the United States each maintain flocks above 1.5 billion, and both countries have major export operations, shipping frozen chicken to markets on every continent. More than 1,600 recognized chicken breeds exist worldwide, but the commercial industry relies on a vanishingly small number of genetic lines. The vast majority of all these birds across every country are raised in industrial systems designed to maximize output and minimize cost. 74% of the world's poultry meat and 68% of its eggs come from factory farms. Think about that for a second. A bird that was once considered too sacred to eat, a bird that priests tended and generals consulted before going to war, a bird that was buried with the dead as a spiritual companion, is now the most mass-produced animal in the history of the world. The red jungle fowl that wandered out of the forest to peck at rice grain has been engineered into something its wild ancestor would not recognize. The modern broiler is 4 times heavier, grows twice as fast, and lives less than 7 weeks. The wild red jungle fowl, by the way, is still out there. It still runs through the forests of Southeast Asia, scratching through leaf litter, flying up to roost at dusk, and crowing at dawn, the same way its relatives did 3,500 years ago, when the first farmers watched them wander into the rice fields. Unlike most domesticated animals, the chicken's wild ancestor is not extinct. You can still go see the original. It weighs about 2 pounds, it can fly. It lives for years, not weeks. And when you see it next to a photograph of a modern commercial broiler, you realize how far the domestic version has traveled from what it once was. The arc of the chicken through human history is unlike any other domesticated animal. Dogs were our companions, horses were our transport, and cattle were our wealth. But the chicken occupied a different space entirely. It was sacred before it was useful. It was worshipped before it was eaten. It decided military campaigns, stood at the center of religious rituals, and was buried alongside the dead with the same reverence given to jewelry and weapons. For thousands of years, the idea of mass-producing this bird for cheap meat would have been not just impractical, but unthinkable, blasphemous even. And yet here we are. From a sacred oracle that could cancel a Roman naval campaign with a single refused meal to a 6-week industrial product sold by the billions, the chicken's journey is one of the strangest transformations any animal has ever undergone. We did not just domesticate this bird, we reinvented it over and over, reshaping it to match whatever we needed most at the time. A fighter, a prophet, a companion, a luxury, and finally a machine. Whether that arc is a story of human ingenuity or something harder to celebrate probably depends on which version of the chicken you are looking at. If this story changed the way you look at the humble birds in your backyard or on your dinner plate, please subscribe and like the video to support our work. We are unearthing the hidden history that they tried to bury. Join us as we plant the seeds for a better understanding of our world. The next treasury of history will be opened soon.